Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With us today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
How are you this morning, Dr. Paul?
Doing fine, thank you. Doing well. We're going to bring up the subject of Fauci.
Yeah.
He's a doctor that works for the government, and Bill Gates.
Highest paid employee of the government.
But he says he doesn't work for the government. He probably works for Gates.
Oh, yeah.
But Gates, you know, we kept saying he would never be in for this thing for money. But it looks like he's still making a lot of money off the taxpayers.
Sure
but anyway, I want to talk about Fauci because he was interviewed this week.
Yeah.
And there's now some analysis going on. Was this a good year? Did the leaders of our country, did the managers of the pandemic, did they do the right thing? There is analysis and a reflection. And, you know, a few of them are admitting mistakes, or at least they don't admit mistakes, but they change their tune.
Yeah.
And they start coming out. But we didn't have high hopes for Fauci, you know, coming out and all of a sudden say, you know, I was misled. I made a mistake.
Yeah.
I'm going to change my ways, and I want to apologize to the people who have suffered so much, all the kids that have suffered. So this is too bad. But he was interviewed, and he stuck to his guns. That's one thing. But sometimes you don't know which gun he has. But this time he stuck to the guns. He was asked about the lockdown. Was it good or bad? And if you took a vote by kids 16 and under, I think it would be about 90% say it's bad.
Easily.
In the parents of those kids.
Yeah.
So, but his answer was, I don't think U.S. made mistakes with lockdown. So I guess we're going to have to be careful. We don't want to challenge the authorities. He says no mistakes were made. I guess some people say, well, what was his goal? Did he have an ulterior goal? And maybe in that sense, no mistakes were made. Because if people were looking for chaos, they certainly were able to create it. If they were looking to challenge liberty and undermine liberty as it being too dangerous for the people, yeah, maybe so. But that's not what they were supposed to be doing. I don't think that was their admitted intention, and not too many people would believe. I have always had trouble over the years believing they would do dumb things like this. I remember struggling with this whole idea when I read the first book about Roosevelt maneuvering us, you know, and finally, you know, it comes around that people get the evidence, and I read books on this, and there was a lot of maneuvering, and their motivations were the same. But Fauci says, no mistakes. That means he'd do it all over again, and he's still pursuing it, even though maybe we could make an exception. Maybe 6 feet reduced to 3 feet.
Yeah.
But that still means he endorses the whole idea that he knows how fast viruses travel. So,
well, you can tell that Fauci, I think at least, is on his back heels a little bit. And I think a watershed moment really was a questioning by Senator Paul, where he really pointed out that Fauci is not being very truthful to people. And I think this is another example. He was on the Hugh Hewitt show, and Hewitt asked him, if you're studying the data, has it led to any conclusion on lockdowns? Because we have some states like California that went for hard lockdowns. They're not doing any better. Indeed, they may be doing worse than Florida, which did not go in for lockdown at all. He said, you understand the sunk costs. Did we make mistakes on lockdowns? And this is where it's interesting, because Fauci starts mincing words, and this is what he did with Senator Paul. He starts mincing words. He was so confident, so cocksure beforehand, and now he starts mincing words. He said, you know, Hugh, I don't think so. I think the lockdown situation is really very complicated. He always does, very complicated. There have been some states that said they locked down, and when you look at the actual tracking on GPS, they didn't. Listen, that's all nonsense. He then later goes on to say, well, you know, it's really, you can't measure it here because the Europeans are the ones that did it right. They did really hard lockdowns, and look what they did. Look at the success. And as we'll talk about later in the program, they're now going into their third and fourth and fifth wave of lockdowns. If the lockdowns worked, if he's going to cite Europe as a success of the lockdowns, he's got another thing coming, because ask any European, ask those tens and tens of thousands of people in Germany and UK and in Poland and elsewhere demonstrating against it, tell us that they work. But I'm going to juxtapose one thing, Dr. Paul, because I want to kick it over to you. But this is a juxtaposition of Fauci. Hey, lockdowns work, lockdowns work. Let's look at that second picture. We'll talk about this in a second. The data shows lockdowns end more lives than they saved. So, Dr. Fauci, please explain to us how it is they worked if they ended more lives than they saved.
Yeah,
What's the goal?
We'll wait a while for the final
We'll hold our
answer.
breath.
But you mentioned it, and I think it's the important point, is that he found the scapegoat. He found not his theories and not what they're doing, but the information wasn't good. The data collection, well, of course it wasn't, because for a long time, and it still continues, they're not even sure how the virus works, and they're not even sure whether the testing works. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of questions to be asked, and now, since it was an untested vaccine, those kind of questions have come up, so all these rules and regulations were untested, or they didn't use common sense. When you think of the suffering of the kids and the economic suffering, it's starting to come out now in economic reports that the economic well-being of minorities much worse than others. So therefore, oh yes, they're going to rectify this and take care of. We're going to spend trillions of dollars, and literally trillions of dollars now. But his final conclusion basically is, if they'd only listened to me and followed the rules, everything would have worked out a lot better. So I'm going to go to another thing related to this, and that has to do with a study that came out looking at lockdowns.
Yeah.
And I think it was New York Post that
New York
had
Post,
this.
yeah.
And the data there shows that this is their contention: lockdowns end more lives than they save. And I think you alluded to that. And that really, in a way, could be the bottom line, even though there's so many things in between, like messing these kids up. It might not be death is the end result, but boy, it can be very, very dangerous. And of course, there's suicide too. So in a way, you can argue that death can result from this, and the death rate is up. More people die from these medical complications than they do from the virus.
Yeah.
So this is a report that shows that the lockdown, there are more lives lost by the lockdown than they do by saving them.
So you have to wonder, by what measure does he declare them a success? In the piece, we both read it in the New York Post. It's adapted from the City Journal and was written by John Tierney. And there are go over a couple of quick things that he says in it. It's very important. He says this: there was a rise in excess mortality, which is one of the most important ways of gauging this, in the elderly, because the elderly are, of course, more affected by the virus. And we know that. We know that as a fact. Some 80% of people were over 80. But, he said, the increase in excess mortality among those aged 15 to 54 was much greater than those of elderly people. And those weren't virus deaths, because we know statistically that people of that age are much less likely to die from the virus. He also pointed out a couple of things. Motor vehicle accidents rose last year to the highest in a decade. Steepest fatality per mile traveled increase in a century. A century ago, we didn't have very fast cars, I don't think. 40% of low-income workers lost their jobs during the lockdown, the lowest. That's why all the white-collar people, they love the lockdowns. They sat at home and raked in the money. And here's another one that I thought was interesting. Johns Hopkins and Duke University researchers found that the U.S. will experience more than 1 million excess deaths during the next 2 decades due to, quote, unemployment shock of what happened last year.
Wow.
1 million excess deaths. And of course, that's just a prediction. However, when you want to talk about them working, that's awfully tough to say.
This new New York Post article cites 2 other dozen articles saying the same thing. When they bring them together, it's just not one person giving his opinion. But he also makes the point, which others have made, and that is, if a private corporation had a success rate like they've had, with the policy of lockdown, they'd all go bankrupt. There's a total failure rate of what they were trying to achieve, and on it goes. And what if you started adding up in details? It's hard to keep up with all the money spent, and you're just talking about future expenses too.
Yeah.
This could go on for a long time, sort of like the ordinary type of war. It goes on for years and years of the suffering and the families that suffer. So we're talking about, so somebody died as a consequence of the lockdown. Well, it's just not one individual. It's sort of like if there's a military death in the Middle East, it affects husbands, wives, families,
Yeah.
communities, the whole works. So, and you're absolutely right. They have no idea, how long this could last. And, the medical part is hard to understand too, because they are not sure of how this virus works. And I think from the very beginning, I've been very, very leery of it using the RNA principle rather than the DNA.
Yeah. Well, you talk about future effects, and here's Justin Hart. He deals with statistics, and this is an extremely well-researched thread on Twitter, and I'm just pulling a couple of clips. But he's talking about the costs of lockdown, and that's very, very well documented. Every clip is WHO, et cetera. 1.4 million additional tuberculosis deaths due to lockdown disruptions. 500,000 additional deaths related to HIV projected because of lockdowns. Let's go to the next one. So 1.4 million, another 500,000. Lockdowns could double malaria deaths to 770,000 total per year. That's WHO. Why do we ignore stats like these? Breast cancer screenings dropped by 89% during the lockdowns. And let's do the final one here. These are just stats. He says, I had 2 friends who died before the age of 50 this year. In part, I blame the lockdowns. Colorectal screenings dropped 85%. Here's projected increase in cancer deaths. 16.6% increase in colorectal cancer deaths. 9.5% increase in breast cancer deaths. 5.4% increase in lung cancer deaths over the next 5 years. These are all information from WHO, from The Lancet, from peer-reviewed sources. So you talk about how the lockdowns directly and indirectly killed way more people, even than the worldwide death toll of the virus itself, which is not to downplay that. But instead of what is the big question? Yeah,
that's for sure. I'm going to go on to mention some medical things. Hong Kong made an announcement today, finding that this was actually the mechanics of delivering the vaccine. It wasn't whether the vaccine was working or a side effect. They didn't even get that far. In Hong Kong, they found 50 cracked vials, 50 out of millions. No big deal. But my guess is, if you found 50 in one city, you're going to have a lot more elsewhere. And I'm sure if there's something defective in the vial or the way it was handled, maybe the temperature changes or something has something to do with it. I don't think they have an answer there. I would suspect that removing 50 cracked vials has solved this problem. And the companies are always interviewed, and they say, yes, and we've taken care of it, and this is within reason, something like that, and we'll check on that. They do that. So I think that is just another sign of rushing it through, malinvestment. This does not come quietly. This comes with taxpayers' money, and the biggest effort was the gobbling up of this money. And I bet you there's a lot of new people who didn't know too much about vaccines, even the ones we haven't even heard from. They've been working on it because they'd like to get in on it.
Yeah, and you were also looking at, this is interesting, how many countries now, and I don't know if it's changed over the last 24 hours or so, but how many countries have halted the AstraZeneca vaccine, the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, and you had some thouts about this.
Yeah, and I don't know the number of companies, but maybe when they remove the vaccine and do a study, and then a week later they come up, we've checked it out, and it's okay. That was okay. But how many should have and how many have, I don't know the final answer on this. But this is interesting because it's a little complex. It has to do with the platelets. They agree now that the Pfizer vaccine will knock down the platelets. And they can identify. They know that, and that actually can cause bleeding. And but then there's also the issue of blood clots. You can have hemorrhages and bleeding, or both. And it reminds me of what we dealt with in obstetrics, because there was a very rare condition in postpartum period where you could have disseminated clotting throughout the body. And serious, where it would be dangerous to it. And the treatment at the time was heparin, to try to dissolve these blood clots. But it was also found out that the system all seemed to consume the platelets and clotting. Then they went into a hemorrhaging period. And they're probably a lot smarter than we were back then, but it's difficult to know exactly which drug to give because you had to feel the way. And it was very, thank goodness it was very, very rare, but it was the case. But this is what's going on here. This is almost an induced situation similar to what went on because it's affecting the platelets. And once again, they're checking it out, but there's just a few. And there'll be minor cases. Some people, there'll be all degrees of it. They might have a small amount of bleeding, but it's the potential. And it's the whole idea that, if you could say, well, we had to give this medication to 1 million people, and we know we saved 20,000 lives from this. That's where they're weak on their argument. Yeah. I don't think they have that evidence. People would take the risk, but right now, it's sort of a panic into taking it. People lining up and actually getting in front of the line and everything. This hype has been built up so strong. So here's excuse me, Hong Kong. I mentioned that about the cracked vials. So if you have a comment on that, but I don't think that's going to go away. That just shows again, the mismanagement.
And again, our position is not that you should take it or you should not take it. We have no position, but you should be informed, and we try to inform people. And this issue with the AstraZeneca that you brought up about the platelets is interesting, and people should consider it, and they should be able to balance and weigh the potential benefits of the vaccine, depending on your age bracket. If you're maybe 15 years old, okay, here's my risk for COVID, here's my risk for the vaccine. People have to look through. So I guess we're going to go on to our favorite European leader, Angela Merkel. Let's have her picture up here. We have to have her picture. She made a boo-boo over the weekend, Dr. Paul, and now she's feeling pretty bad about it. She wanted to shut the whole country down, even the grocery stores, for 5 days over the Easter break. Even the grocery stores, forget about your Easter lamb or your Easter ham or whatever you have, forget it, and you can't even go to church. Well, this is interesting. That's you have to back down.
Let's give her the credit that she's 100% honorable in her motivations. And sometimes you don't know for sure because there's always a conspiracy theory behind some of this stuff. But she went and did this, but now she's backed off. I mean, at least she says that we've gone too far. So this is in a way a good news story, even though you don't know exactly how her brain is working right now, where she stands. But it's actually better than Fauci. It just never. It never leaves this kind of information, the good information coming out to sort of make the point that we shouldn't be panicked into doing these things. Policies are really slow to change. Some had never joined, and that's good, but some now are moving away, but there's still a lot of people. So to me, it was so shocking when she did this, when she put these new sanctions on, worse than ever. And I don't think they had any evidence to show that a lot more people are going to die if she didn't do this, so.
I think it's the third time they've done it, and it hasn't worked. So if it didn't work the previous times, why are you doing it again? And if it did work those previous times, why are you doing it again? But I think what happened is that she also saw revolt in her own CDU party. The conservatives started revolting a bit, and in fact, the presidents of several German states said we're not going to enforce this. So I think she realized that she had extended beyond the point where she could back up what she said. Besides, she's an old commie. She probably hates all Christian holidays anyway. She was an operative in the East German communist regime, so I'm sure she doesn't like the idea of Christmas and Easter. And the things, the Germans, they already gave up Christmas, and they weren't about to give up Easter. And good for them.
Somebody had a definition of what this is called when they keep doing the same thing over and over again. I think they used the word insanity. That's how you define insanity. I'm going to go over to talk about Sweden, unless you have another follow-up on that. Yes, Sweden, which avoided large-scale lockdowns, saw a lower 2020 death spike than most of Europe. Well, there's evidence again. Will the others wake up and say, why don't we, and will the people in the United States wake up and say, South Dakota did pretty well, Florida's doing pretty well, California is in the dumps,
Yeah.
New York's not doing so well. Not only are the ideas a little weird, the people are a little weird too.
Yeah, no kidding. But it's this is new data that's out. Now we're getting new quote science, actual science, and looking at it. And let's look at that next clip, because this is from the article which appeared in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch about Sweden. There's just a little clip up there that we can put up. Yes, preliminary data from EU statistics agency Eurostat, compiled by Reuters, showed Sweden had 7.7% more deaths in 2020 than its average for the preceding 4 years. Countries that opted for several periods of strict lockdowns, such as Spain and Belgium, had so-called excess mortality of 18.1 and 16.2% respectively. More than twice as much percentage of excess deaths among the lockdown states than among Sweden. And Sweden did bad with elderly folks. The rest home was a disaster. So if you take that out, they did even better. But if the lockdowners are right, if Fauci is right, Sweden should have been at the bottom of the barrel when it comes to all this, and they're not.
But if Fauci followed his own rules, he would say there's a fallacy in the collection of that data. That data just isn't right, so they didn't collect it right.
That's right. That's right.
That's an easy way out.
But the experts, I think, are losing the narrative. And I think they're getting nervous, and I think so because of that, they're double talking. And here's in that same article, which goes on and on to say, well, just because the statistics are showing that they made the right choice doesn't mean they did. But here's Professor Mark Woolhouse. He's from the University of Edinburgh. And he says, he talks about the success of Sweden. And he says, no. He says, all of us have to be really careful interpreting the data connected with COVID-19, whatever its source, because none of them are perfect. So all of a sudden we have to now be skeptical of the data. Where were the data skeptics when Neil Ferguson came out and said, if you do everything I say, only 500,000 of you will die in the UK. Only 2.2 million will die in the US. Where were the data skeptics back then when they got these unbelievably, unprecedentedly incorrect, predictions from people like Ferguson and others? Oh, no, that was then trust the science. Now it's don't trust the science.
There's tremendous power in propaganda. There's tremendous power when the authority people, the ones in government, the politicians, in spite of their negative image, as well as media, they're still very, very powerful. And it's disappointing that even now, this is, however, in the article we were quoting, 43% of the Swedes have high or very high confidence in how the pandemic is being handled. Maybe next week it'll change. But it isn't like they had inside information or they read those data charts. They didn't read that stuff. They only listened to what they were told by people. But that's the way life has been, and that's the way a lot of people, Americans have been taught this basically, that I was taught to have respect for the policemen and have respect for law enforcement. So there is this idea you have respect for, so you hear it, but all of a sudden they now say that the people have gone along with it. The propaganda is there, and they still think it's being successful. But we'll do this poll in a month or two.
See what happens. Well, I've just got a couple of things to close.
Right.
From mine. I like to do the charts because I think the charts, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Is that what it says?
That's right. You don't want to hear me.
No, I know. I don't want to hear me. I want to show some pictures because I like pictures. I like picture books. Let's look at this next one. Here's the U.S. daily new cases. And here's, if you look up right there toward the top, Biden said COVID will get worse before it gets better. January 21st, before it fell off the cliff. And here's Fauci on March 7th. The current virus plateau is unacceptable as it continues to dive. Cases are down 72%. Deaths are down 61%. Normally you'd think that's good news. They don't think it's good news. And let's look at the next one. Here's the new head of the CDC. Don't have a lot of faith in her. Here she is on March 1st. Look where the curve is going. Free fall. She says, deaths have started to go up again at 2,000 per day. Well, I checked today and they're well below 1,000. So here she goes. Deaths are down nearly 40% since her comments. So not a lot of faith. I don't know if you saw this yesterday, Dr. Paul, but this was really bizarre. Donut shop, Krispy Kreme. Donuts, I'm not a big donut fan. But they said, if you get your COVID-19 shot, we're going to give you one free donut every day for a year, which makes you wonder because it's obesity that makes people get even sicker with COVID. So people had a laugh about that. I'm sure some people have taken them up on it. But here's something that I like even better than that. Let's throw this last clip for a little good news story at the end. Here's a gym owner. He said, in light of Krispy Kreme giving free donuts for receiving the COVID shot, here at the Attila's gym, we are giving out free memberships to all who don't get vaccinated. And you'll like this part especially. We believe in health the real way. Exercise, good diet, plenty of vitamin D, zinc, and an environment to de-stress. So good for him, providing some alternatives to eating a donut every day.
And I would say that you could boil that down to just saying, just use common sense. You know, my dad was born in the year 1904, and he was independent-minded, a very religious person, very conservative. But I think back on some of the basic instructions that he would give us when we were little on how we eat and what we did. And later on, I thought, he's not a doctor, you know, why is he doing that? But after I got through medical school, I said, you know, that's a pretty good advice, you know. So he didn't have any formal education. I think 6th grade, so that might have been a benefit to him. He stayed out of some of this indoctrination. Today, it certainly would be the case. Back then, school was not nearly as detrimental as this day. But what is the tragedy that we're facing today is, yes, you shouldn't depend on the public schools, and you should do more homeschooling and all this. But under these conditions of a society that has bankrupted the society, and it means mothers always have to be out of the house, and nobody's there with the kids, and they use the schools for babysitting and all this stuff. And the teachers have all been indoctrinated by university professors that are cultural Marxists. You know, that's where the real problem is. So it's a real challenge, and I wish it were as easy as saying we need more common sense. But I think if you're confused at all, just use your own common sense, you know. And I would think most people would say, I love donuts. But yeah, I do know that a donut isn't going to solve our problems. So it's something that I think, Daniel, you did on the program today, pointing out with one of your charts how ridiculous this is. You know, the charts go up, and what do they say? They say the opposite of what's really happening. So I think making fun of these people is very good. It's less stressful to make fun of them and just sort of laugh at these people rather than getting stern. I don't follow the position where Bernie Sanders frequently has been right on some issues. I worked with him on Federal Reserve, but he just had a personality a little bit different. He was very stern, if you've ever noticed, and I don't think that's achieved. I think if we want to get people's attention, we're going to work hard to find these. And if you have anything interesting that's really good that hasn't been covered in the media, let us know, where it's just so ridiculous. Right now, I have kept a lot of those, but they're accumulating, and I think there's a ton out there. So we want to keep doing that, because if you can make fun and have a little enjoyment, make people laugh, maybe they'll be more open to what we consider the important cause, and that's the cause of liberty. And that's what we're working on, making sure that people understand that limited government to the purpose of protecting our liberties probably is the most important thing we can do, politically speaking. Of course, that's unachievable unless we are dealing with people who start with a basic moral foundation of how to use it. The moral foundation of a libertarian is don't hurt other people, which is pretty religious speaking. When you look at all of history, even before the 10 Commandments, they knew about that. No lying and killing and cheating and all these things. That was known way back. So I think just a few fundamental moral principles. But today, the Marxists, if you read about Marxism, they saw the Marxist position that they determined what was right and wrong. I remember early on, when I was just studying about these ideas, that the Communist Party was the ultimate decider of truth. And that was it. They really believed that. The truth didn't come any other way than the party. Well, we have to refute that. There's a way of finding out what the truth is. It's not too difficult to find, and it's readily apparent for anybody who looks for it. But that's the argument we're going to make in order to promote a cause that we think is important, and that is for peace and prosperity, and we're going to continue to do so, and we invite everybody to join us to help spread that message. Thanks for tuning in today, and come back soon.